but I am delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about where we go next. And I was very interested in one of Pietro's slides from earlier, where you talked about in the colonoscopy setting that the number of randomized control trials went through the roof once everybody was really happy with the technology and we had a clear end point and we were able to really do all that. And I guess what I'd like to talk about is, well, how do we do that, and what are some of our next steps? So I'm a trialist, so I'm also a nerdy trialist, and I'm very interested in how trials work, not just doing them. And trials are kind of interesting because if you look at the kind of changing face of clinical trials over the last 70 or 80 years, there's a few things that you start to notice. Firstly, in the early decades of clinical trials, they were primarily funded by public organisations, by the MRC, by the NIH and its predecessors. And it's only over the last, I suppose, 30 or 40 years that industry has really become the dominant funder of clinical trials. And that's largely due to a New England Journal of Medicine editorial. Lots of things are due to editorials that appear in New England Journal of Medicine and others. But this editorial in 1956 was effectively saying that people should be really, really cautious about taking the word for anybody on anything without some real evidence. And one of the things that editorial did was it triggered a change, a really significant change in legislation, which was the 1962 amendment to the FDA Act. And what that did was it required randomized controlled trial evidence for all new approvals. This was really, really interesting because it, for the first time, said to industry mainly, if we accept most new products are coming from industry, it said, you gotta do a randomized control trial. And that's why we started to see in the 70s, 80s, and subsequently so much investment from industry in randomized control trials. And that was done on the basis that trials are the gold standard. If you do a trial and you show something with a trial, you're good to go. Right? Well, maybe not. Where are we? Where have we got to in trials since then? The market value of trials in 2022 globally is about $56 billion. It's got an annual growth rate predicted between 2023 and 2030 of 5.6%, projected to be a $90 billion business by 2030. This is just the trials piece. It's not all of the R&D that precedes trials. There's about 3 million people globally work in clinical trials. But we've also seen an incredible explosion. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov, and there's a nice little data analysis package you can use to get into the detail of clinicaltrials.gov. In 2000, there were 3,000, the year 2000, there were 3,000 new clinical trials registered. Last year, 450,000 clinical trials registered. And when I started to filter that data the other evening, because obviously with this audience this morning, I was thinking, how many of those are surgical trials? And it seems 8%, but I'm going to put a big bit of caution there. It might be less than that, because some of those might be trials of a chemotherapy following surgery. So how we classify trials. But it is interesting to think about the scale of that, because surgical trials, as we all know, are really, really difficult. And some of the complexity is baked in. Well, firstly, as trialists, we like to design things in a very homogeneous and standardized way. Surgery is not homogeneous. It's quite heterogeneous. It's heterogeneous in terms of the different anatomy of different individuals. It's heterogeneous in terms of the different training and experience of the surgeon. Surgical trials are really difficult also from a comparator arm perspective. We hear those things about, sham surgery or controlled surgery. How do we do that? This is problematic because if we don't have sensible comparator arms, it's really difficult to build a hypothesis, because hypotheses mainly rely on us having a degree of equipoise that we can examine in an experiment. So this is really challenging for surgical trials. We also have problems with, obviously in most trials, we control for bias and confounding using blinding and other techniques. Blinding in surgical trials is, again, quite different, and also controlling for observer bias. And I'm really, really interested in the image analysis work that was presented by some of the previous speakers, which I think might get us to a point where we might be able to better use intraoperative image analysis to overcome some observer bias. And then there's also the topic that Dan introduced earlier, and others have followed up on measuring things, on the metrics. And in trials, we have to have some way of measuring success. There has to be a simple way in which we can say the intervention was good or not. And that's really, really challenging, because in trials in surgery, obviously, outcomes are multifaceted. There's the functional endpoint of the surgery itself, but then there's complications, there's pain, there's rehabilitation. It's complicated. It's not as simple as, did a particular parameter change? Has a simple result been altered? And of course, logistics. Doing an operation in a surgical trial costs an awful lot more money than giving somebody a pill. So the costs of doing surgical trials are really significant as well. So one of the things I think we have to think about is, how can we improve this? How can we make it more amenable? Because I would argue that all of the wonderful innovations we've heard about so far this morning, and you will continue to discuss over the course of the day, will best serve our patient populations when we can clearly demonstrate the impact of those interventions, and we do that best through trials. So we have to think about these challenges, and sometimes to look forward, we have to look back. One of my favourite papers that I like to read in the context of trials was this New England Journal of Medicine paper from 1977, which said that coronary artery bypass graft was not beneficial for most patients. And that conclusion was reasonable in 1977. And it was largely reasonable because it was at a time when people were still learning how to do CABG. So measuring the efficacy of an intervention while you're still figuring out the intervention is a really, really tricky thing to do. Imagine doing a drug trial, an IMP trial, with a whole series of different molecules while you're still trying to figure out which one is stable and which one isn't. We'd never dream of doing that. A very famous Italian surgeon, René Favaloro, one of his reflections on this paper at the time, and he was instrumental in developing the CABG techniques, he said that randomized trials have developed such high scientific stature and acceptance that they're accorded almost a religious sanctification. If relied on exclusively, they may be dangerous. And I think there's a really important message in this for us, that yes, trials are really, really important. Yes, trials are ways in which we can demonstrate the efficacy of an intervention, but they certainly are not, don't have the characteristics of requiring or demanding religious sanctification. And the message from this is that when we do surgical trials, we have to control a lot more things than we do when we're doing an IMP trial or even a device trial. Because in this case, developing or trying to measure the efficacy or effectiveness of something while you're still developing the technique just doesn't work. But the other thing is that approach always assumes that the innovation is superior, that by doing something new, it's going to be better. And that's not always the case, particularly if you're only learning to do something new. So we could assume that the AI guided surgery is going to be better. But maybe while we're figuring that out, while we're optimizing the technique, as we've heard so much about this morning. Maybe right now it's not going to be better. In the future it will probably be better, but not right now. And this leads me to this idea that I really think we should all think about is systems co-evolve. We don't just wake up one morning and have an idea for a trial that takes a technique and implements it and everything works beautifully. Things co-evolve. Techniques co-evolve. Our understanding co-evolves. So this co-evolution, I think, is really important. And that brings me to this idea, and I've been thinking about this for a number of years. So, as I mentioned at the start, I'm a trial nerd, but I'm kind of a nerd in general, and I'm really interested in evolutionary biology. And if you're not interested in evolutionary biology, you should be, because it's just a wonderful way to think about life. And there was a very famous evolutionary biologist in the 70s called Lee Van Valen. And Van Valen came up with this theory that effectively said that no matter what we do, and sorry for delivering the bad news, coexisting species will always become extinct. That's inevitable. And this theory is very, very well established at this point in time. And it's based on this idea that as we co-evolve and as we develop together, us and our competitors, that eventually we'll get to a point where there's no more evolution possible. So the rabbit and the fox example, the rabbit learns to jump further because the fox learns to run faster. And they'll keep doing that until a point where something else will come and take them both out. And I think about this Red Queen hypothesis quite a lot in the context of clinical trials, because it's emphasizing to us that we're having to develop our thinking, perhaps in terms of image analysis during surgery, at the same time as developing our ability to be able to test hypotheses around the effect of these interventions. Van Valen was also a very interesting guy. Like most of us who are academics, and there's a lot of academics in the room, we're all frustrated by article processing charges. You write the paper and you still have to pay to get it published. It drives most of us mad. Van Valen got really vexed about this and he set up his own journal, in case anybody is having any thoughts about that. He also, he was a very, very successful scientist, but he also, in the one of his big papers, he put this as an acknowledgement into his paper, which I just think is brilliant. He said, "I want to thank the National Science Foundation for regularly rejecting my honest grant applications for work on real organisms, thus forcing me into theoretical work." So he had this idea that if you made stuff up for your grant application, you'd be likely to get funded. Don't bother putting in real science. So if we then kind of accept this idea that we're kind of in an arms race to both develop techniques and technologies and at the same time enhance our clinical trial understanding, I think there's three things that we can do in that domain that will help us to improve our engagement with surgical trials. And those three things are the designs, the ways we approach trial design. One of my great hopes as a trialist is that within the next 10 or 15 years, the parallel group randomized control trial will be gone. They're very inefficient, they take too long, they cost too money, and they don't really, in many cases, represent the real world. So we have to think about other designs. We have to think about how do we use technology to enable trial conduct. And Dan mentioned some of those elements this morning, and I'll mention a couple of those. And then I was also really interested in that mention earlier about AI literacy. And I'm interested in AI literacy in this context as we are in trial literacy from a patient perspective. How do we make sure that patients are equipped with the knowledge they need to be able to engage, to be able to be part of a clinical trial? So what are our approaches to patient engagement? In terms of trial designs, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but let me jump here for a second. One of the things, and I'm not quite sure why this is not the case, but cluster trials haven't been used as widely in surgical trials as they could be. And I think that's a missed opportunity, because what a cluster trial is, it's really simple. All it does is, instead of the unit of randomization being an individual patient, The unit of randomization might be a surgeon, it might be a hospital, it might be a ward, it might be a country. So it allows you to kind of build into your system the fact that there's going to be some variability around the place. One surgeon may be more experienced than another. One hospital may see more complicated cases than another. So cluster approaches allow us to do that. And particularly when we're talking about system-level interventions. And to me, AI in surgery and precision surgery is a system-level intervention. It's not for an individual patient, it's to make all of the patients do and benefit from them. So I think that's really, really important. Other things that we can do is, as I said earlier, one of the challenges in surgical trials is if the technology is evolving, whilst the surgeons are training on that technology, measuring an endpoint in that setting or the impact of an intervention is really, really difficult. A stepped wedge design allows you to take into account, at least partially, effectively you take some people, they're enrolled into the trial, they progress, and then you stop, and then you go to the next group. And it allows for the fact that you are going to develop your techniques and you're going to develop your understanding as you progress. Things like adaptive trials are also a really, really helpful approach in that they allow us to account for improving patient outcomes. So patient outcome is getting better because the surgeon is getting more experience, the technology is improving, the quality of the images is improving all of the time. So that's happening all the time, regardless of the intervention. And adaptive or platform trials allow us to do that because they take into account that standard of care changes all the time. Again, one of the reasons why the parallel group trial is something I'm not too fond of. They are challenging because the statistical planning and execution is difficult. I think pragmatic trials are also a really big opportunity for the surgical trials community, real-world trials where you're assessing effectiveness in the routine clinical environment. This is really, really important because most trials are done in an artificial environment that doesn't tell us about what would normally happen. So if we have a whole slew of better designs and more relevant designs, and we can implement those, what can technology allow us to do also? So there's a number of things. We can do a lot with digital tools, and wearables were mentioned earlier on as well. So better characterization of individual patients and their endpoints. A lot of really big, significant interest in real-world data and digital health platforms, which we've been hearing lots about this morning. This ability to be able to capture much finer grained phenotype, even in the operating room, that tells us much more about the individual patients as they present, but perhaps gives us a much better sense of the prediction of what's going to happen to them over time. Of course, and I won't speak about it too much, but there's a really significant opportunities in AI and machine learning to adopt those as technologies within our clinical trials. We're doing some work already on blockchain for data security. The question earlier about trust, I think, is really, really important. But I don't think it's just simply a question of about should we trust the data scientist or should we trust the surgeon. I think it's should we trust the data and how we handle that. So using blockchain, I think, is really important. And I was supposed to be talking in the afternoon session about where there would be people from our regulator as well, Garode, and regulatory technology is obviously a really important part of that. I'm going to jump ahead here because I know I'm going to run out of time. So we have lots of opportunities around technology. So better designs, better technology. What we need to turn our attention to then as a community is how do we make sure that we engage patients? How do we make sure that patients look to come to the hospital that is doing precision surgery trials? That patients know they can come and they can trust that it's not the robot operating on them, it's still the same surgeon, but they're using a set of tools that allows them to deliver much better outcomes for their patients. So how do we do that? I think we have to think a lot about patient-centered design of trials. We have to think a lot about how we demonstrate to the patients the enhanced outcomes that they will deliver. But we do that by performing trials. We must move on from the idea that we can take a technology and implement it and all is done, and rather focus on doing trials to generate that level of evidence. And that's why it's for us here in UCD, it's a particular pleasure to see this meeting here today, because as has already been mentioned, the Classica project is a project that Ronan is leading, that we in the UCD Clinical Research Centre are the sponsor of, and my colleague Pat Murray oversees that activity, and Pat will contribute to the panel this afternoon. But I like to think that in that way, and over the coming years we'll grow this, we're really making a contribution to developing and rolling out more of these clinical trials that are needed to convince everybody of the better outcomes that are associated with precision surgery. So I'll leave it there, and again, my apologies for disrupting your schedule today, but great to get the opportunity to present. So thank you.